Hi, my name is Mary Lobson, and I'm the founder of Reese. Welcome to the Reese community. We're here to talk about innovation, best practice, and promising practice related to harm prevention. I'm really excited to have with us today Tracey Vitchers. Tracey is the executive director of It's On Us. They've just are celebrating their 10th anniversary, so we're excited to catch up with Tracey and see what's new and what's happening within the organization. They work across the country as a national sexual assault prevention nonprofit. They work in a number of different ways, as you'll see as we talk through the podcast, and really excited to hear more about the work that they are doing, in particular to engage men and male athletes. So excited to have her with us. She's part of Culture of Respect, the Every Voice Coalition, as well as Safe Bay. So thank you for joining us. We're here to talk about creating impact, making change, and shifting culture. Welcome to the Reese community. And I am very excited to be joined today by Tracey Vitchers, Executive Director of It's On Us. So welcome, Tracey.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining. It's great to chat with you. It's back to school. Things are in full swing now. We're beginning of October. I understand that September was a big month, 10th anniversary of It's On Us. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit, for those viewers who may not know, what is It's On Us and why does this anniversary matter so much?
Absolutely. It's On Us is the US's largest nonprofit program dedicated to campus sexual assault prevention. Approximately 1 in 5 young women, 1 in 4 trans and gender nonconforming students, and 1 in 13 men will be sexually assaulted at some point during their college experience. And It's On Us was founded originally 10 years ago as a public awareness campaign of the Obama-Biden administration. And since I've taken over about 7 years ago, we have really shifted our model away from just public awareness and engagement to peer-to-peer prevention education, which I know we'll talk a little bit in more detail about later. But really, peer education and empowering students is at the crux of everything that we do.
Why is that important?
We know that there are so many different ways that you can educate young people about really tough issues, including sexual assault, mental health, other major social justice issues. And we find, with all of the research, we find that peer-to-peer education is the most effective because it's both social norming, but also education. And so if you are teaching young people, hey, here are these prevention education programs on consent or on how to be an active bystander, and then they take those lessons and apply them within their campus community or their sub communities of that campus, the message resonates more powerfully with their peer group. It is less effective to bring in traditionally an outside speaker, somebody who is not from that community, who may not understand the nuances of how sexual violence occurs in that community, or the power dynamics that occur, or who those major social influencers of campus culture are. Students know that best. And so we really find that by giving students the proper training and tools to have these conversations in a really effective and, yes, data informed, but also in some cases fun way, it's actually way more empowering and leads to the outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah. Well, and this is a difficult topic for a lot of people. It can be hard to talk about. People have their own experiences with it. And so I think where there's opportunity to have the experience around it also be lighter when we're talking about awareness and engagement with students is really important. You have, or It's On Us has campus chapters across the US. So can you talk a little bit about what that model of engagement looks like? Like if I'm a student on a campus, it's fall, it's back to school. If I'm wanting to get involved, what could that look like for me?
Absolutely. So we have more than 400 campus chapters nationwide in 38 states. Our goal is to get to all 48 continuous continental by the end of this school year, actually. And our program model is really sort of a train the trainer and campus-based chapter network, as you mentioned. So if a student already has an It's On Us chapter on their campus, they can find that out by going to our website. We have a chapter map on our website that they can search for their school. If their school pops up, it gives them information about how to get in touch with that student group on their campus. And if they don't have one, they can use our website to start a chapter.
Oh.
And we really take what we call a rubber band approach to our chapter structure, where we can support a student in adapting, sort of stretching or constricting the chapter model to fit their unique campus needs. In some cases, our chapters are completely student run. They are an independent student organization. They have their own executive board or governing board with their chapter president, vice president, very formal structure. We also we've also seen them run out of student government agencies at different schools. So there might be a member of the SGA who is their It's On Us lead for the SGA, and all of their work flows through that official body. Or we've also seen the structure come out of, for example, the school's Title IX office or campus sexual assault prevention office, depending on if they have a sexual assault prevention office. Some schools only have Title IX. And in those cases, there's typically a faculty advisor that oversees the chapter. And with some of our schools that have been around for a while that have that structure, those It's On Us student leaders are paid in peer educators, which is really great. And that's the model that we would love to see. Really, because students should be compensated for their labor, right, by their school. They are actually making their school a safer place that benefits everyone. And so in those models, we really see having a faculty member who is really supportive, who is a champion of students, who really understands the need for prevention and student safety, and they really empower their students to work very closely with us. But in those cases, they often have a robust budget. As I mentioned, sometimes they're paid. Similar with SGA, SGAs often provide robust budgets, whether if It's On Us is a formal part of their SGA or if they're a registered student organization. And so our chapters then have minimum requirements to stay sort of in good standing with the It's On Us national team. They have to re-register with us every year as an official chapter, making sure that if, say, the previous chapter president graduates, they're passing that baton. So that way we know who is our best contact at that school if it is a student and not a faculty advisor. We also require them to participate in 2 peer educator trainings every semester. We currently offer 18 peer education programs that students can be trained in, covering a range of topics from sexual assault one-on-one to men's engagement to alcohol and violence prevention to intimate partner violence awareness and prevention. And so, and those programs have all been built based off of both the research in the fields, but also the research that It's On Us has conducted. And we have a pretty robust evaluation strategy so that way students who participate in the programmings take pre and post surveys. We're able to track efficacy of the programs over time. And then we have basically a 2-year cycle where we revisit all that evaluation data and make any tweaks or changes necessary that come both from student feedback, but also if there's new research published or culture changes. And we need to make sure that our programs are not static and that they are evolving with culture and student needs.
Yeah. And all those peer engagement sessions are online, right? So there's very low barriers for someone to be able to attend or to fit those into their schedule.
Correct. We offer 2 ways for students to get trained. One is through monthly virtual peer educator trainings that, as you mentioned, are conducted online. We have a member of our team who is dedicated to conducting those trainings. And then the other model is we host every semester 2 regional summits, we call them. And those are in-person gatherings where students from across one of our regions come together for an in-person day of training and learning. And those are really wonderful events because they not only allow the students to get trained in our 18 core programs, but we also bring in outside speakers. We recently just had our summit in Washington, D.C. in September. It was our first of this school year. And we were able to have a member of the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights Title IX office come in and speak to our students about what's going on with the Title IX regulation, what kind of standards and expectations should they expect from their school under Title IX while there is this temporary block of enforcement at certain institutions, and how the Office for Civil Rights can support them in navigating their cases if something comes up. So it was a really great opportunity Yeah, it was amazing. And it was a great
Mhm.
opportunity for students to hear from somebody who literally helped write this regulation into being.
Yeah.
And we really try to ensure that they get that kind of exposure to other leaders in the field.
Mhm.
And last but certainly not least, like the in-person summits are an opportunity for students to connect with students from other schools. And
Yeah.
so, in Washington, D.C., we had students from Georgetown, we had students from American University, we actually had midshipmen come over from the U.S. Naval Academy that's not too far away. So it just gives students a chance to get to meet and network with other like-minded peers that care about this issue and compare notes of what's
Yeah.
going on their campus and what's effective, what challenges are they having, and how can they show up in support of one another.
Yeah, it's an amazing model because, as you spoke about, it can look on a campus in very different ways depending on the capacity, both from an institutional perspective and then also the SGAs and the students. You may have someone who's just beginning to think about how do we create a chapter, and even just from that place of being one person with an interest in raising awareness on campus, they have the ability to start that process and engage. So that's really amazing, to have that opportunity. Are there are there challenges with this as a model? Like it's a huge undertaking, and you've done so much in 10 years. What are some of the challenges with
Yeah.
doing this?
I think the primary challenge we face is, unfortunately, there are institutions who think about the issue of campus sexual assault strictly through the lens of risk mitigation.
Mm,
And, one of the challenges that we face is underneath the Clery Act, schools are required to provide 100% of enrolled students with some form of prevention education during their time on campus. And that is separate and apart from Title IX, right? That is the what is required under Clery is very different than Title IX. And I often see those two laws as working in tandem with each other, where the Clery Act really requires that prevention work up front to then reduce sexual assault. And then Title IX is there to protect students if,
mm,
God forbid, sexual violence
yeah.
happens. And unfortunately, what we have seen over the last 10 years is the really well-intended action of saying schools, you need to provide students with prevention education, has now sort of led schools down this path of just wanting to check the box to demonstrate
Mm,
compliance. And compliance is the floor, not the ceiling.
yeah.
But unfortunately, what we've seen is schools adopt these sort of out of the box programs that don't actually respond to the needs of their student community. And in particular, combined with both like this compliance issue, but then also with COVID, we've seen schools become overly reliant on these online prevention education programs, if you can even call them that. I largely think of them as sexual assault risk management programs.
Mm,
It's the same companies that would produce, your online sexual harassment training for a for-profit company or a nonprofit. And students basically sit and click through them. Typically, the barrier to entry is you have to complete this program before you can register for classes. That's kind of like the stick, right, that schools use to require
yeah.
students to do it. And we know that these programs are not effective. And they're not effective for a variety of reasons. The first is they're typically conducted during freshman orientation when students are just trying to get acclimated. They are new to a campus environment. They're just clicking through them really, really quickly so that way they can get into that econ or Psych 101
Mhm.
class that they were so desperate to get into. Um, they're also very busy and they're getting inundated with like a whole host of new information at the beginning of the year. And if
Mhm.
you're a first year student, this is probably your first time moving away from home. You have to
Yeah.
establish a whole new friend network. You might be living with a roommate for a first time. There are a lot of challenges that come with those first couple of weeks of your freshman year. The second is that these programs don't allow students to ask questions and they're not interactive. They're interactive to the degree that they are asked questions that they have to respond to, but the answers are pretty obvious and students know what their school wants them to click,
Mhm.
right? They know what they want to hear. Um, and so they just sort of click through them quickly. But if a student has a question, they can't
Mhm.
ask this online tutorial the
Yeah.
question that they have. And that is something that we are really seeing with all of the research that It's On Us is conducting with college men right now, is that college men in particular are saying that these programs are really ineffective, they're not engaging, and they don't allow them to ask questions. And the other challenge with these online programs as well is that they wrongly assume a certain amount of baseline knowledge from students that unfortunately the majority of students do not have coming into college.
Yeah.
The second is that these programs don't allow students to ask questions, and they're not interactive. They're interactive to the degree that they're asked, that like they are asked questions that they have to respond to, but the answers are pretty obvious. And we're about to launch a new survey that measures sexual health education among college men prior to college, because we're really trying to draw that connection between the lack of sexual health education in K to 12 and the lack of healthy relationships and consent education in K to 12, and the negative impact it then has on prevention education efforts in college. But it came out of some of the research that we've already been conducting, where we were asking, male college athletes in focus groups, how many of you had sexual health education in K to 12? Only about 50% of them said they did. And the type of education that they received varied. It was, anywhere from the biology of reproduction to abstinence only sex education. And then when they were asked, okay, of all of you who had sex education, how many of you had sex education that included consent? None.
Yeah. It's not talked about.
Right. And
it's not included. Yeah.
That's really scary. And so then when these young men and young women get to college, they're then given this online program that assumes someone has talked to them about this before. And for many of them, if they've had education, it's been, to that point, abstinence only, just the biology of reproduction, or it's been informal in nature. And we don't know what they're being taught informally because it's coming from parents, from friends, from other family members, from media. And that information may not be evidence-based.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, as we talk to our campus partners, another layer of that is international students who may come and don't necessarily understand the legislation, the language. And so there's just those additional barriers to accessing the content and being able to understand what it means for them and what that means from a practical perspective on campus. You mentioned male athletes, student athletes, and so that's a great segue. Certainly, you've been doing research in engaging men now a couple times that has come out. What are some of the big findings? And you spoke a little bit about that, but kind of what are you seeing in terms of patterns and trends? And is there a difference in what you saw kind of from when you did it the first time round to when you came a second time? Have there been changes?
Absolutely. That's a great question. We conducted a 3-part study. The first part was our Engaging Men Part 1, and that was 20 one-on-one hour-long interviews with college men. And the intention of that qualitative research was really just to get a baseline understanding of how young men are thinking about this issue, what kind of education they've had, do they find that education effective, and look at a diverse range of young men's experiences. So talking to young men who are student athletes at big Division I schools, right, to young men who are going to small liberal arts colleges and are studying art history, and really trying to understand what their experiences are like and what are those common themes, but also what are some of those differences that may come out because of the type of school that you go to, the location of the school, or just who you are, and your identity and your place in that campus community. And that opened up a floodgate of more questions, right? And I think the best research makes you want to ask more questions.
Absolutely.
And it definitely did for us. And so from there, what we heard was that there were very clearly unique challenges with 2 populations of men on campus. And those were men who participate in Greek life and men who participate in college athletics. And that aligned with other data and research that has been conducted in the field. There was a 2019 study that indicated that the majority of serial perpetration on campus was being was being perpetrated by male athletes and men in fraternities, right? We've seen some of that data come over year over year over year. It's typically why men who are from those student populations are subjected either, because they're required, for example, through the NCAA requires all NCAA student athletes additional prevention training annually, or through Greek Life, their national organization requires additional training, or their local college or university requires them to go through additional prevention education. But what we found was, again, as I said earlier, they didn't really find the trainings to be effective, and they didn't find the conversations to be helpful. And so we sort of took a step back and we said, okay, of these two populations, where do we want to go first, right? Because you can't undertake two massive research studies for these populations at one time. And we are very lucky because we've had a long-standing partnership with the NFL, who funds work on sexual and domestic violence prevention and response. And so I reached out to our partners at the NFL, and they were able to provide funding to us to conduct research with male student athletes. And as part of that research, we spoke to 710 male student athletes from 9 colleges and universities across all NCAA divisions, as well as a community college.
Wow.
And in those conversations, there were very clear trends that the majority of them, again, did not have that sexual health education prior to coming to college. There were often there was also a lot of challenges around at what age and how did they first learn about sex? The majority of them first learned about sex from friends or family or through pornography, which again, we know has its challenges and has its issues with portrayal of consent. We also found that many of these young men were having challenges in their relationships, and they wanted to talk about relationship issues more so than anything else. And then we also found, which was fascinating, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but then the other piece too was about their relationship to their institution and how they sort of see themselves in relation to their school, and how they think their school sees them as male athletes in relation to this issue. And we've already talked about the sex ed stuff, so I won't go any further into that, but on the healthy relationships pieces, what we found was that these young men, they want to have healthy relationships, but because all they've been told in their perspective is what not to do. And so they're like, well, I'm not supposed to do this. I'm not supposed to do that, but nobody's telling me what to do. And right. So how do I navigate a fight with my girlfriend in a healthy way? How do I set boundaries for myself? How do I communicate my own needs in a relationship? They're not being taught those things. And one of the other pieces that we found that actually came out very significantly in our third component of the research was a quantitative study, was in every single one of these focus groups, at least one young man described an experience that very clearly meets the definition of them having experienced some kind of intimate partner or dating violence at the hands of their girlfriend, but none of them labeled it as such. And it was one of those situations where, Kyle Richard on my team, he's our head of men's engagement, was the person facilitating these focus groups. And when this would come up, it was traditionally framed by the young man as, well, what do I do when my girlfriend's acting crazy? And I think, in the survivor support and advocacy world, I think the orientation is to go, oh, are you gaslighting her?
What are you doing? What are you doing?
What are you doing? Why are you calling her crazy? But then as Kyle started to unpack that, it became very clear that what these young men were describing was they were trying to communicate to their girlfriend, I don't want to hang out with you tonight. I want to have dinner with my team, or I want to go play PlayStation with the boys. And then the reaction from their female partner was for them to then engage in manipulative behavior or abusive behavior. We had one young man describe an experience of, the girlfriend breaking his PlayStation. And that was really upsetting, right? And what they were saying was I don't know what to do in those situations because, my girlfriend's taking swings at me. She's throwing things at me. And I'm afraid because I am bigger than her. I'm stronger than her. that if I try to like just simply restrain her to stop her from harming me, that I'm going to accidentally hurt her just to protect myself, and then I'm going to get reported for domestic violence, right? And so when we started to unpack that, we realized like, oh, a lot of these young men are having these experiences, but they're not labeling them as dating violence. They very much see this dating violence as men harming women. They don't see themselves as potential survivors or victims of domestic and dating violence. And then what impact does that have, right, on their mental health, on whether or not they seek resources and support? How does that manifest in other challenges for them later, you know, in their college career and after? And so that was something that we wanted to dig into in the quant study that we eventually did. But the other thing that we found with the athletes that was really fascinating was just their mistrust of their institutions. And they don't trust their institutions to take sexual assault seriously. They don't trust their institutions to handle investigations seriously. And that was largely because of the young men who expressed this distrust. It was because they knew somebody who had, like, who was close to them, who had tried to go through a Title IX process, and it was botched. And that's a problem, because athletes on campus are huge influencers of campus culture. And if they're telling, you know, and if one of their friends who, you know, has experienced sexual violence is coming to them and saying, this happened to me, and they are not trusting Title IX, they're not going to direct that person to Title IX or the support services that are available on campus. And then that just lends to this cycle of underreporting, right? And distrust. So, you know, we really wanted to dig into that as well in our quantitative study. And in that third quant study, we surveyed over 1,100 young men. And we oversampled for men in the LGBTQ community and men of color, because those populations are typically largely underrepresented in this research. And I was very glad we had more than half of the young men who took the survey were men of color, which was great. Which was a huge win for us. We were so happy about that. But we were also we also asked them a series of questions so that way we could slice the data along certain types of student populations later. And so we asked them, do they participate, or have they participated in NCAA college athletics? Do they participate in Greek life? And that allowed us to then take the data and isolate the data from those populations and compare it to students who were outside those who were not identified with those populations. And what we found just sort of across the board was that those student populations who are more likely to be seen as perpetrators, right, athletes and men in Greek life, are receiving more prevention education. However, when were asked a series of questions about, would you consider these behaviors unhealthy or abusive in a relationship, they were less likely to correctly answer. So
interesting.
Right. So this more education is not necessarily leading to better outcomes, which then calls into question, what type of education are they receiving?
That's interesting.
And that really reflected some of the conversations that we were having with the athletes prior during the focus groups. Was they were saying, you know, we want good prevention programming. We want prevention programming that teaches us what to do, that helps us become better men, that helps us have healthier relationships. But instead, what their school is giving them is either these out of the box online programs, or they're bringing in outside speakers, but it's like a once and done type of event. It's not continuous multi-dose learning, which we know is the evidence-based best practice for prevention. And in many cases, the facilitator was not somebody who was relevant to them, and the tone and messaging was off. And most of them described, you know, leaving these, if they had in-person sessions, leaving the in-person sessions feeling as if they were the problem, and that they were all being labeled as potential perpetrators, potential rapists, but they don't see themselves as such. And so then why are you going to engage, right? If you're sitting in a classroom after practice and they're giving you pizza and water, and you're being asked to listen to somebody from your local domestic violence agency talk at you for an hour about how you're part of the problem, why are you going to lock in? Why are you going to tune into that conversation? You're not going to leave that conversation feeling empowered to be part of the solution. And the other piece that we found too, that was I think both shocking and not shocking to me, I guess, was in the quant study, you know, I think we often talk about this 1 in 5 number for young women,
Mhm.
right? About like 19-20% of young women graduate college having
Mhm.
experienced sexual assault.
Yeah.
Of the young men who completed the survey who identified as student athletes, 17% of them
Mhm.
reported having experienced some kind of sexual assault or dating violence throughout their course of their life.
Mhm.
That's almost as close to that 1 in 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was the same for men in Greek life. They
Mhm.
had those really high rates of numbers.
Yeah.
And if they're
Mhm.
experiencing this violence either at college or prior to coming to college, that means that that violence is normalized in
Mhm.
some way in their life.
Yeah.
And so how do we have those conversations with those young men in a way that, yes, holds them accountable for prevention, but do
Mhm.
so in a trauma informed way that acknowledges that there may also
Yeah.
be survivors of violence in those rooms when we're having these conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. That's important. We, I guess coming up a year ago, we launched the Respect Hockey Culture Center,
Mhm.
which is a North America wide reporting platform for um, uh, players right from junior up to semi-professional. So the USHL right up to the American Hockey League, and I think part of the conversation at that time was, we think of, exactly as you said, we think of athletes are the ones who are perpetrating violence. They're the ones who are, engaging in behaviors and causing harm, and not necessarily looking at the impacts of harm on them. So that's a really, like you say, surprising, not surprising
Mhm.
information that you got out of there. How does that? So you've talked about learning so much.
Mhm.
What have you done with that? Like, what is,
Oh,
I want to say so what, and I don't mean so
yeah.
what, but like, okay, so, tell us a little bit about the
Mhm.
playbook and some of the other things that you've been able to do.
Absolutely. So, using the findings of all of the research, we've developed what we call our playbook for male student athletes. And we essentially enter into MOUs with colleges and universities across the country to bring the playbook to their male student athletes. And that work is facilitated by Kyle Richard on my team, who oversees men's engagement. And he partners with the schools to understand, what does their athletic culture look like? What male sports teams are on campus? Are they Division 1, 2, 3, junior, community college? What are some of the challenges that the schools have had with prevention education with that student population in the past? And how can we, bring our playbook in a way that feels effective?
Mhm.
Also, with the lens for unfortunately, has the school had a scandal with a student athlete
Yeah.
recently? Like, that's situational awareness that we need to have going into these conversations. Um, and we built the playbook based off of the findings to address these very specific needs with male athletes. So there's the foundational course, which is the first of the 5 programs. All the programs are intended to be conducted in 45 minutes or less within the male team setting. And for big teams like football, we recommend splitting them out, whether that's offense, defense, or, some other way to sort of separate them out. We did a stress test where we had an entire football
Oh,
team
yeah.
during the pilot.
It's just too much.
It took an hour and a half,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it took so long because the young men actually were really excited and
Mhm.
they wanted to have these conversations and they were so engaged, but we couldn't get through the program because they had so many questions.
Mhm. That's
And so we were like,
awesome.
and so
Yeah.
which was great, but we were like 100 is too much. Like, that is
Mhm.
too many
Yeah.
young men in the room. And so we, for those bigger teams, we split them, in some way to try to make sure that it's the people who they're practicing competing with most, that they have those relationships with them, and that it really feels like it's a place of psychological safety where they can ask questions and not feel like they're going to be blamed or talked down to.
Mhm.
We've gotten some pushback on the fact that we conducted strictly within just those men's teams environments,
Mhm.
particularly with teams that often more traditionally practice and compete in a mixed gender environment, like cross country, track and field, swimming. Uh, and often it's coming from a place of the women who are on the on the associated team not trusting the program
Mm.
and
Yeah.
feeling like they need to be in that room to kind of like police what these men are learning.
Mm.
But it actually has the adverse effect,
Yeah.
right? It makes them less likely to ask questions.
Mhm.
And because they're so worried about being canceled. Like
Yeah.
that is the number one fear that this generation seems to have, is being canceled by
Mhm.
peers. And so
Mhm.
we really push to have this work conducted in that, single gender environment,
Mhm.
where there is that trust, that safety. And the first program is really, sort of our sexual assault and consent 101 training. But
Mhm.
it starts with the same icebreaker that we used in the focus groups, because we found it to be so effective of at what age and how did you first learn about sex?
Mhm.
And so it's both data collection for us, but it's also
Mhm.
an icebreaker activity. And we sort of frame it that, and we kick it off that way because it's like kind of funny, right? The guys are like, like Kyle always jokes, he's like, and everyone, there's like one that says like porn magazines. And it's like, where are you finding these magazines? Like, you have the internet, like your grandpa's Playboy. Like, how are you finding these things? And so we sort of like have those moments of humor, right? That sort of break the ice, help them feel relaxed, realize that like Kyle's there to have a conversation with them,
Mhm.
not to, point fingers or place blame. But we use it to level set the expectation with them, that we say, okay, like here's how, and
Mhm.
at what age you first learned. Then the next question that they get asked is, did you have any formal sex education in K to 12?
Mhm.
And that's again like maybe about half have.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then Kyle uses that to tee up the conversation to say, like, look, what I am seeing here is most of you have never had formal sex education prior to coming to college.
Mhm.
And we're here to help you get that education in a way that is healthy, in a way that is positive, and in a way that is safe. And just reframing the conversation to, we're here to support you in your educational journey. We're here to be part of your, player development staff. We're here to help you become the better men that you all want to be. The tone of the room shifts
Mhm.
completely. And they get so focused, they get so excited. The questions are just, they come flowing out, but they're also learning really important lessons, right? And we're also seeing how different populations of men respond to different scenarios that they're given, right? In the consent training, we present a scenario where where it's a scenario of nonverbal consent.
Mhm.
And in all of the pilots, and this stood out to me so
Mhm.
clearly, when we conducted the pilots, what we saw was we would get to that scenario and then we would say, did the young woman in this scenario give consent?
Mhm.
And it's an example of nonverbal consent. And in every single pilot, the white men in the room said, yes, she gave consent. The men of color said, no, she did not.
Interesting.
And then we would say to the men of color, like, can you explain your rationale? And they say, I need a verbal yes.
Mhm.
And then you say, why do you need a verbal yes? And they're like, well, my mom, my sister, my aunt. And it's always a woman in their life who has said, you need a verbal yes. And when you trace that back, right, you trace that back to the false allegations of rape being weaponized against Black men in this country,
Mhm.
and that harm that's been committed, and the fear of false allegations
Mhm.
against men in the Black community being weaponized. And so like you see that very plainly. And so that allows us then to have a nuanced conversation then with those young men about, there's even positions of privilege and hierarchy based off of race within these team settings.
Yeah.
And how do we unpack that and help them leave this room feeling more informed? And so, we have that's our initial training as our sort of like baseline. We consider that the start of the, the sports season or the semester training. And then there's 4 additional trainings that cover bystander intervention, healthy relationships, how to exit relationships in a way that's healthy, how to kind of fight fair, how to end relationships in a way that's smooth. And we have one that really, we don't call it survivor support because we realize so many young men don't label themselves as
Yeah.
survivors. They feel like that's a label that can only be assigned to women. But it's, we frame it sort of like through the lens of like mental health and trauma, but it's a survivor support program. And it takes into recognition, right, that while some of these young men may not have been physically or sexually abused themselves, they've grown up in houses with domestic violence where they had to step in to protect their mom or their their sister, right? And helping them unpack that trauma and helping them realize that like there are support services available as well. And, we just, we did a year pilot last year. We had really great results with that pilot. We made some minor tweaks to the program, but we've officially started implementing it with campuses this school year. And, Kyle was just at Miami University in Ohio, this past weekend, big D1 school, got to go in and the schools and the athletes really like it. They see Kyle and our team as like an extension of player development. And that's really what we want to be doing, right? We want to be helping these young men see us as that resource and see us as those tools and support that they can rely on. Questions, if something's confusing, if something's happened and they've experienced violence and they need support, that they know that there's somebody else out there that's got their back.
That's really exciting and encouraging, right? That there's such an interest by young men and male athletes in wanting to be better men, in wanting to learn more, right? Not just because it's part of a requirement to being an athlete or to being in school and checking that box. And I appreciate it, it's kind of early days still in this program, but how do you scale? Kyle is your person. Yeah. How do you bring that to the masses, or do you think about that?
Yeah. So really the intention is for this to become peer-to-peer. And so we're with most of our schools, we're entering into 2-year contracts where the first year is Kyle coming in and introducing the program and identifying students who are, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, who are really bought in and interested in doing more work with us. And then him working to coach them to then become those peer educators for year 2. And the other thing that we're doing, we just hired another men's engagement team member who's located on the West Coast, Patrick Maddox. Patrick was actually our It's On Us intern when we conducted the prevention as a team sport research with athletes. He was the person sitting there coding all of.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, he coded a lot. He learned how to code. He did a lot of coding of the transcripts and worked with our team and really understands the data. And, Patrick is a former Division I football captain. He played at Utah State and is just phenomenal. And so, the goal is that as we bring on more schools, Kyle will have either full-time or part-time staff located across the country who are geographically located near schools and be able to go out and do that deployment. And so Kyle's really like growing, his own team underneath the It's On Us team of former student athletes who are excited about this work, want to do this work, either, professionally or, if they're still on campus as a peer educator for this. And that's really, we're trying to take the sort of general It's On Us model that we have, but implement it very specifically within that athletics context schools.
Are there schools who are, have active campus chapters who are bringing in the, Kyle in to kind of do the work with male athletes as well?
They are. Yeah. They are. So one of our really longstanding chapters is Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, and they've, they're now partnering with us to deploy the playbook as well. So. And they're one of those really robust chapters where they have a faculty advisor who's in their Title IX office, who's been there for a while. She gets It's On Us. She loves the model. She's really bought in. Her students are really bought in. And so when we made the decision to launch the playbook, she was one of the first to raise her hand and say, we want to bring this to Kutztown. And because there's already that brand awareness, right, of It's On Us on campus, they do their pledge drives, their chapters already there. And for us, it's really like that sweet spot, right, of like partnering with schools that already have a high brand awareness, who already have an active It's On Us chapter, and then bringing in the playbook as that secondary component, right? And then the goal is over time, we won't just have the athletics playbook, but then we will have additional programming that is culturally specific to other student populations, including Greek life. And we've already begun some of that research with Greek life. We had, but Greek life is very different because Greek life is both within and outside of colleges and universities, as opposed to our student athletes at that school. There's also coaches in those rooms, and that is not the case.
Mhm.
So it's a very different kind of environment
Yeah.
working with Greek life. And so we recognize that research is going to take us probably 2 to 3 years
Yeah.
to
Mhm.
conduct and complete that research and then develop a program based off of it,
With that.
pilot that program, and then officially launch.
Mhm.
That's going to be a bit of a longer
Yeah. Longer
process.
game. Can you speak can you speak for a minute about coaches? And, do they have a place kind of related to the playbook or in the work that you're doing on campuses? And what does that look like?
Absolutely. Coaches have a huge role to play, right? And we really recognize that that athletes look to their coaches,
Mhm.
right? They look to their coaches for guidance, they look to their coaches for support. In many cases it's at some of the bigger schools, right? It might not necessarily be like the big head coach, but it's who are the assistant coaches or who's the defensive or the offensive line coach, right? And they've built relationships of trust with those coaches, and they look to them like to signal, right, what behavior is and isn't okay.
Mhm.
And so we do work very closely with the coaches and the athletic directors and the athletic staff when we bring something like the playbook in. One thing I will say is that when we do the playbook with the athletes, coaches are not allowed in the room.
Mhm.
And that's again because they will sort of look around and be like, uh-oh, like, am I going to
Mhm.
do the wrong thing?
Totally.
Which
Yeah.
is totally fair.
Yeah.
So we have separate meetings and conversations with the coaching staff, separate and apart from the athletes, but we do have resources and tools for those coaches too to help continue the conversation, because
Mhm.
it doesn't help the athletes if we just go in and we give them the training and the coaches have no idea what was said in that room, right?
Yeah.
Or what
Yeah.
the intended outcomes are. And so we do have those really great conversations with coaches, and we've been very lucky to have some really big champions within coaching staff at some of our partner institutions, like who sort of draw that line in the sand and say, no, like, our university is committed to creating a culture of violence prevention, and so we are making sure that every single one of our athletes shows up to this. Every
Yeah.
member of the men's basketball team, volleyball team, football, right, like, they are showing
Awesome.
up, they're participating, and that's
Mhm.
been really great to see. And yeah, and we're just excited about this next stage of growth for the playbook. We're sort of gearing up our next round of partners
Mhm.
for implementation in the spring and the next school year. And the thing too that I've really been trying to drive home is I think that unfortunately schools do this thing that actually like cause it. They don't realize that I think they're like doing it and not realizing like the harm that it's causing,
Mhm.
where they sort of fall into the trap
Mhm.
of athletes are the problem.
Mhm.
And they will often pinpoint certain teams as the problem.
Mhm.
And traditionally in the US, it's usually they pinpoint the football team.
Yeah.
And there might be a problem on the football team,
Mhm.
but I was a swimmer. There were problems on the swim team,
Yeah.
right?
It's not isolated to a
Right.
specific sport.
It's
Yeah.
not isolated to a specific sport, but when it's perceived as only the football team is getting this training,
Mhm.
or only the football team is required to go to these things, it just reinforces for
Yeah.
those players that like, oh, my school sees me as the problem.
Yeah. That's where the problem is.
Right.
Mhm.
And that's where the
Absolutely.
problem is. And so we really try to push the
Mhm.
schools and say, like, no, if we are coming into this, we are not just doing it with the football team. We are
Mhm.
doing it with all 100% of your male athletes.
Mhm.
Because they are all setters of culture.
Yeah.
And we want them to see themselves as positive setters of
Mhm.
culture, and not just sort of go, oh, well, they already think I'm a bad guy, so who cares, right,
Right.
if I do the bad thing. I think one of the really like moments that gave me hope was, this wasn't even when we did the playbook pilot. This was when we were doing the focus groups.
Mhm.
Kyle had conducted a focus group with a Division 1 ice hockey team.
Mhm.
And a couple weeks later, he gets an unexpected phone call from the school's Title IX coordinator. And she says to him, I don't know what you said to those young men in that hockey team. She's like, but this past weekend, 8 of them intervened and
Mhm.
stopped a rape from happening.
Wow.
Yeah. And she's like, and when I asked them
Yeah.
how did they know what to do? Right. They were like, well, Kyle told us to do this. Right. They were like, Kyle said we should, which is like, right. They were like, Kyle, and it's on us, said that this is
Yeah. This is what we do.
this is
Yeah.
what we do.
Yeah.
And to me, I was like, that just stood out as such like
Mhm.
one conversation, just
Yeah.
one
The
conversation.
power of that one conversation. And like you said, you said earlier, to hear that or be in conversation with someone who they can relate to, they can identify with, seems is very different than having that told to them. That's really significant.
It's not
Mhm.
going to be effective if I go in
Yeah.
that room and deliver
Yeah.
the message,
Yeah.
right? I'm self-aware enough and okay with that,
Yeah.
right? Like I
Yeah.
want the messenger to be the best messenger possible.
Mhm.
And and I think, sometimes we have to really, but if you really, really, really want to see culture change and you really want to see prevention education be effective, you got to put aside your own ego.
Mhm.
You have to, and be self-aware enough to say, I am not the best messenger for that information.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. We were having this engaging men conversation at our summit this past weekend, which is traditionally student leaders of ours. They are traditionally young
Mhm.
women.
Yeah.
And Kyle and Patrick were having this engaging men fireside chat, talking about the work that they're doing, the research, how they
Mhm.
see their role of engaging men, and how the It's On Us chapters can better engage men in their work.
Mhm.
And one of the young women asked a very fair question, right? Which was, why do we have to do this? Like, why do we have to educate these young men? And like, they should just know. And, and I saw Kyle and Patrick kind of gave me this look, right? Like, that's a very fair question. And it was like, that's a very fair question. But they were both self-aware enough to know that they were not the appropriate person to answer that.
Mm.
And they kind of made eye contact with me and I stepped in.
Mm.
And I
Mhm.
and I said, I was like, look, I get it. I get it. Survivors should not have to be the ones who are having these conversations.
Mhm.
But I was like, remember at the start of the presentation when Kyle and Patrick were talking about the lack of sex ed
Mm.
and like the basically 0% of consent education that these guys are getting
Mhm.
prior to college versus young women being raised in rape culture,
Mhm.
right? Young women are being taught these lessons at a
Yeah.
younger age from the perspective of self safety, right?
Mhm.
Keep yourself safe.
Mhm.
Young men are not being taught those things.
Yeah.
And I said, I was like, and we need programs like It's On Us, and we need programs like the Playbook,
Mhm.
because I want to get to a place where young women are not having to be the messengers of this information and men are holding each other accountable.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Mhm.
And so it is going to take some work on behalf of women to help bring men into the fold. And I know that that's not fair. And I know that that's frustrating, but that is unfortunately the reality that we are living in.
Mhm.
And when I said that, you just felt the whole tone in the room
Mhm.
shift.
Mhm.
And they were so much more willing to engage with this, and they got it, right?
Interesting.
They understood that,
Yeah.
oh, like, I know that this shouldn't be my burden to carry.
Mhm.
They're not learning it prior to college. Our school is only taking a compliance approach,
Mhm.
and peers are the best people to deliver this information. Okay, like, let's find some guys and recruit them to our chapter who can help
Mhm.
facilitate some of these conversations again, so we don't have to. But it's
Mhm.
going to require some conversations with men and some education with men to then get
Yeah.
them on board.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's challenging in so many different ways, like all the nuances, all the different components, the different roles that people have in the work and the places for people to be in the work and how and what they bring to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's exciting to see the evolution of It's On Us over these last 10 years. And it seems like you're quite positioned to do some really exciting things into these next 10 years. So certainly Greek life is on your radar, continuing to advance the playbook, growing the chapters across states in the country. Are there other things that you would identify as priorities coming up for you?
There are. We have our 18 programs that our campus chapters are trained in. And one of the things that I'm really excited about was like that number is new. We expanded our programming at the start of this school year to include culturally specific programming for LGBTQIA students. And so we're sort of have two tracks of program development, right? We have our track for specific harder to reach male student populations, like athletes, like Greek life. But then we also but we're also starting to move into culturally specific prevention programming for specific student identity types that aren't necessarily like high risk for perpetration in the lens that athletes in Greek life are seen as, but are, still under-resourced and that they aren't receiving culturally specific programming. And LGBTQIA students is one of those student populations. And we're also looking to develop programming specific for HBCUs and students at HSIs, because again, those are student populations that are often not reached with culturally responsive prevention programming. So we have some new funding coming in from a partner that's going to fund us to do that work really intentionally over the next few years. And I'm very, very excited about that, because we know, right, so many of these, again, like out of the box programs don't reflect the unique experiences of students at HBCUs or students at HSIs. And we need to develop culturally specific programming for them and have, effective ways of deploying those prevention programs within those student populations and in those institution types. So I'm very excited about that work. I think what is unique, right, about It's On Us is that if you have a campus chapter, all of our resources are free to you, right? And we're not charging schools hundreds of thousands of dollars like some of these outside companies are to come in and do this work. Like we say to schools, like, if you commit to supporting an It's On Us chapter, we will train your students for you. We will give them access to these programs at no cost, right? Because safety should never come with a price tag. It just shouldn't. And I don't think anyone should be profiting off of rape culture. Like we just shouldn't be. And so, we really, the 18 programs in our campus chapter model are free. They're free to schools. And with our playbook, right, there is some cost associated with it, but it is supported by philanthropy, right? We are able to keep those costs extremely low because of, groups like the NFL providing this really critical funding to us. But there is additional cost, right, of flying Kyle, to these schools, doing that ongoing consulting with them. And, and I also believe like Kyle should be compensated for his labor, right?
Absolutely.
And so there is, sort of like a fee for service component there, but it is nominal. And we really try to make sure that we are meeting the budgets that schools can afford to bring us in. And that is because we were able to support, lowering that cost through the philanthropic support of groups like that.
That's great. So if I'm a student, watching this, what's my way to get involved? Do I go to your website?
Yes.
Check my campus. What's my best way?
Head over to itsonus.org. You can check our campus chapter map, see if your school already has a chapter. And if not, there is the opportunity to register to start a chapter. If you fill out that chapter registration form, you'll be connected with Blake Kitterman, who oversees our campus organizing program. And he does a full suite of onboarding with all of our new schools and helps them do a landscape analysis of their school, understand what prevention programs are or are not in place, if they are a campus in crisis, right, that's had a big scandal recently around sexual assault on campus, or the Title IX office has botched something, and how can we step in and support those students in developing their chapter.
Okay. And if I'm an institution, if I'm a campus who is thinking, you know what, we really should bring in additional resources, training, playbook, if I'm a director of athletics, how do I move forward?
Yeah, again, head over to the It's On Us website. There is a drop-down menu specific for the playbook. And on there's a form that you fill out, and it connects you with Kyle and Patrick on our team, and they set up a conversation.
Okay. Well, you know what? I really appreciate you making time today to come and join the Reese community. We, are excited to see what's coming next. And yeah, just really excited for the opportunity to connect, and congratulations on all the work. And you know, you've done a lot of work, but it's meaningful work that's making change on our campuses with our young people, and that has ripples into their relationships, into their future generations, into their workplaces, into so many other aspects of their life that extend well beyond just the campus community. So yeah, congratulations on your anniversary, and all your work. And as I say, look forward to seeing what's next,
Thank you.
and following along.
Thank you, Mary. No, it's been so great chatting with you, and I appreciate you
Mhm.
having us on.
That's great. Thanks so much.